I'd like to welcome everyone to the Monday, February 28th, Maplewood City Council Manager Workshop. City Clerk Sint, would you please do the roll call for us?
Councilmember Cave.
Here.
Councilmember Juniman.
Here.
Councilmember Knudsen.
Here.
Councilmember Villavicencio.
Here.
Mayor Abrams.
I am here as well. All right, tonight we need first to approve our agenda. Is there a motion?
I move to approve the agenda.
Moved by Knudsen. Is there a second? Second by Juniman. The motion to approve the agenda for tonight. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, then let's vote. And the order tonight is as follows. Councilmember Cave.
Aye.
Councilmember Villavicencio.
Aye.
Councilmember Juniman.
Aye.
And Councilmember Knudsen.
Aye.
I vote aye as well. The motion is approved. We have no unfinished business. We do have new business tonight, and that is the update on Emma's Place. The way we're going to do this tonight is I will start with City Manager Coleman, who will do the staff report. And then we're going to hear from our police department, from Lieutenant Michael Duga and Officer Ashley Bergeron. And then we also will have two representatives from Emma's Place on the line. We have Tanya Brownlow, the executive director, and also there will be a board member that Tanya will introduce. And after they have an opportunity to speak, then we're going to have an opportunity for council questions and comments. So with that, let's get started with City Manager Coleman with the staff report.
Thank you, Mayor Abrams, members of the City Council. Back in January, the City Council directed staff to set up a meeting with the manager and board members of Emma's Place to discuss the high volume of police calls and other disturbances in the immediate neighborhood. The issues with the police calls, you're going to hear about those this evening, have been a drain on city policing and also their budget. It's our desire tonight to create better relationships with the residents at Emma's Place while also being mindful of the impacts to the business community and overall public safety. As you mentioned, Mayor, tonight we're going to hear reports from Lieutenant Duga and Officer Bergeron on the background data for police services utilized by Emma's Place. I think that this is a really good start for us and the Emma's Place community to try to understand how we can de-escalate some of the issues that are happening there and create a better neighborhood and partnership for the neighbors, but also for the city as we work through some difficult issues. So with that, Mayor, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, City Manager Coleman. Lieutenant Duga and Officer Bergeron, you're up next for your PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you for having us, Mayor. I appreciate it greatly. Ashley Bergeron is going to begin the presentation with a bunch of information that she has put together, and then we'll be happy to answer questions as we go.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, everybody. Sorry, you have to see a blurry screen. So in order for my volume to work, my video has to be on. So I apologize. You'll have to look at my blurry ceiling for a few minutes until I can get it shared.
Not a problem.
All right. Okay, let's try this again. All right, good evening, Mayor Abrams and members of the City Council. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Officer Ashley Bergeron and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator and Multi-Housing Officer for the Maplewood Police Department. All right, for some reason, it doesn't like the first slide, so we'll just move on. So what all did I review for this presentation? I pulled all case data from 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and the first month and a half of 2022. I used the police department's report software also known as Zerker, to pull out these numbers. I looked at specific addresses from the city. This included over 50 locations, and I will go more in depth into the specific addresses a little later in the presentation. I combed through each case by looking at the case comments and dispatch info. A lot of the complainants, such as business owners, were calling in and used the specific phrases Emma's Place kids or juveniles from Emma's Place, or kids that live across the street. In a lot of cases where the descriptions were vague, I reviewed body camera footage to determine if it was Emma's Place juveniles or if the case was precipitated from residents of Emma's Place. This again is not an exact number of cases. I'm sure there's still cases out there that didn't have enough identifying information to link Emma's Place to it, but some of the calls were just too vague, such as juvenile kids in the area gone on arrival or theft no suspect information. In these cases, there's not really a good way to create a link between Emma's Place and calls for service. So before we dive in further into the specific locations and calls for service, I want to talk a little bit first about understanding the critical impact problem properties have on the surrounding life. Imagine, if you will, for 1 second, just still water. When one pebble is dropped into the still water, the pebble creates a ripple effect, causing a large area of water to move and spread. This presentation not only looks at the calls for service when we are called, but also the intersections, surrounding businesses, and other families and residences nearby. When crimes are occurring, it not only impacts Emma's Place, it spreads to all of our outer community like a ripple effect. When incidents occur one place, the lasting effects reverberate to the areas near it. All right, so this is a map showing what businesses and locations were included in the data extraction. As you can see, the businesses are in purple, residences and homes are in pink, and the intersections are teal. There were 25 businesses, 26 residences, and 4 intersections. You'll note that some of them are outliers, such as Speedway at 1750 White Bear Ave. And then there's also a pink residence that would be off of Hagen Drive. And then there's also another business north of Highway 36. Just to give a little bit more background information, the pin on Hagen Drive, which is going to be the pink pin that's on the lower left hand of the map, was the result of a motor vehicle theft that occurred at the address by Emma's Place juveniles. The juveniles took the vehicle back to the area of Emma's Place, but because it started in Hagen Drive, that's where the pin dropped. So this is where we look at all the numbers in totality. These are all of the calls for service that are correlated with Emma's Place resident involvement and calls for service from Emma's Place locations, which are 2161, 2163, and 2165 Van Lake. All calls for service were included except for PPVs, which are also known as proactive police visits, which are initiated by officers to prevent or deter criminal activity. And the second call for service incident code would be meetings with management or units that were also initiated by officers. As you can see, in 2017, there were 77 calls for service. In 2018, it more than doubled the previous year with the 170 calls for service. In 2019, we see the most drastic increase for calls, 223, which is nearly triple the calls from service of 2017. In 2020, there was a decrease in calls for service overall. It then increased in 2021, being the third highest in the 5-year total. 2022 is not up there because we are just finishing up month 2 of the year. So now that we've looked at the total calls for service from 2017 through 2021, let's take a look at the calls for service separated by month. It should come as no surprise that the highest calls for service are summer months, which is generally around the time of summer vacation. June, July, and August are much higher than their surrounding months. This is apparent and a common theme represented each year. I want to take a few minutes just to touch on the summer activity from last summer, summer 2021. From the data you can see for 2021 June, there was 26 cases, which is the same as 2019, the highest calls for service year. July had 25 calls for service, and August had 29. In just a 3-month span over the 3 summer months, Emma's Place residents, more specifically juveniles, were responsible for 72 calls for service. Between June and August, there are 92 days, 92 calendar days. 72 calls for service over 92 days is equivalent to over 5 calls for service each 7 days, or 5 calls for service each week, meaning we responded nearly daily in summer of 2021. So these are the incident codes that I will be referring to during the presentation. And do not worry, there's not a quiz at the end, so you won't be quizzed. These incident codes are what I'm going to be referring to for the duration of the presentation. This list doesn't have all of the incident codes that the Maplewood Police respond to, but they're definitely the vast majority of them. This list only includes the incident codes that are related to Emma's Place calls for service. When we look at crime stats as a whole, it's important that we distinguish between the violent crimes and the lesser crimes. Some incident codes of violent crime on this list include arson, which is the intentional and deliberate setting of fire to a property, setting fire to property. The next is assault, which for purposes of this presentation, assault is a physical attack that can involve hitting, punching, kicking, slapping, spitting, and or using an object or weapon during the act. Burglary can also be violent or non-violent. Burglary is entering a building illegally with intent to commit a crime like criminal damage or theft. Child abuse can be a violent crime, whether it stems from assault or general neglect. CSC, also known as criminal sexual conduct, speaks for itself and it being an act of sexual nature against the law. Domestic assault is also exactly what it sounds like. It can be the act of fear or a physical act. Robbery is unlawfully taking property by force, a weapon, or by using threats of force or threats of a weapon. Sometimes motor vehicle thefts can first be construed as a robbery, especially if a vehicle is taken with force or with a weapon. For instance, that's what people refer to when they talk about carjackings. VOP is a violation of a protection order, and that can be anything from a social media contact to threatening acts or physical assaults. Lastly, we've got the weapon code. Weapon is a code often associated with somebody wielding just that, a weapon. And in most cases, the weapon calls refer to an individual with a knife or a gun. As you can see, the top call is DOC, also known as disorderly conduct. According to Minnesota State Statute 60972, disorderly conduct can occur on a private or public property and is an action that alarms, angers, disturbs, provokes an assault or breach of the peace. It encompasses brawling, fighting, offensive, obscene, abusive, boisterous, or noisy conduct, or an offensive, obscene, or abusive language, tending reasonably to arouse alarm, anger, or resentment in others. So, in other words, fighting, trespassing, arguing, being belligerent, and using repetitive vulgar language is seen through the eyes of the law as disorderly conduct. Out of the 788 calls for service, 201 of them are disorderly conduct. That is a quarter, or 25%, of all calls for service involving Emma's Place. The overwhelming majority of calls for service are directly related to the juveniles at Emma's Place, so it should come as no surprise that juvenile incidents are number 2 on the list. The majority of disorderly conduct calls are juvenile involved as well, but the JUV, Juvenile Incident Code, is far more broad and can encompass non-crime activity. Domestic assaults, aka DOM on the screen, are 52 of the 788 calls for service, which, given that the data also comes from Emma's Place, which is 2 large multi-housing complexes, is common to see domestic calls. PCNs are just that. They're following up with the residents, following up with juveniles, and following up with the businesses regarding ongoing cases. It is alarming to see that there are a high number of assault calls, though. As previously discussed, they are considered to be violent in nature. So to sum things up, from the last slide and this slide here, I was looking for the violent crime calls for service, which are illustrated by the 52 domestics, 23 assaults, 12 burglaries, 7 violation of order of protections, 5 motor vehicle thefts, 5 weapon calls, 3 arson, 3 child abuse, 2 robbery, and 1 CSC. Now, it is important to note that the vast majority, save a couple of numbers, are where the individuals from Emma's Place are the perpetrator of said events. Some of the calls, such as the VOPs and burglaries, have complainants that reside at Emma's Place. So, to put the data into something a little more visually appealing, here are the top 20 calls broken down. As you can see, the vast majority are disorderly conduct at 30%, while the second highest are 8%, which are the juvenile incidents. So this is where we break down the location of businesses. Of the 25 businesses that were looked at, these are the ones that had Emma's Place involvement. For the sake of this presentation, businesses that share the same address code were grouped together. So Starbucks and Temple Fresh are grouped together, as well as Fleming's Auto and Minoco Gas. The Highway 36 corner shops includes Chipotle, Firehouse Subs, T-Mobile, Sprint, Papa John's, and FedEx. So looking at the data, you can see that the business that was most impacted in the 6 years has been CVS Pharmacy. Sharing a fence line with Emma's Place, CVS has been the target for a large amount of disorderly conducts, juvenile incidents, shoplifting, and thefts. The YMCA and Starbucks and Temple Fresh have 17 calls for service in the past 6 years. This may seem like a small amount, however, Starbucks just recently opened its business a couple of years ago, and Temple Fresh has just recently opened. If you look at the length of time the laundromat was open and compare it to the calls for service regarding Emma's Place juveniles, it's extremely high. So bear with me on this slide. I know it's not the prettiest to look at, but these tables show the breakdown for the calls for service businesses have had that have a call for service greater than 1. As you can see, the top call for service continue to have DOC as the top incident code or reason for the call. And those are highlighted in red. All right, so I want to give a little bit more information regarding CVS. Since 2017, CVS Pharmacy has had 264 calls for service, which is pretty high considering. Of those 264 calls for service, 67 of them were directly related to Emma's Place juveniles, not Emma's Place adults, Emma's Place juveniles. That is 25% of their total call volume. And again, all of this data does not include the meetings and does not include all of the proactive police visits that we've done. On the surface, when you look at the calls for service, 42 calls for service in a span of years for a drive-through business doesn't seem as much of a concern, right? However, when you look more into it, you see that over 40% of those calls are stemming from involvement of Emma's Place residents. That's close to half of those calls for service being caused by one underlying issue. Like I mentioned before, Starbucks moved in a couple of years ago, and Temple Fresh was just recently. There have been 42 calls for service. Remember when we went through the different incident codes on the previous slide? As you can imagine, having a drive-through and a laundromat service in the city, you're bound to have a variation of calls for service. However, just in the past 2 years, 17 of the 42 calls for service were related to Emma's Place juveniles. So this slide shows all of the businesses, not all of them, but the top businesses that have been impacted by Emma's Place calls for service. So you can see at the YMCA, of the 501 calls for service they've had in the past 6 years, 17 of them, also known as 3%, were related to Emma's Place. 8% of McDonald's calls for service, 5% of Fleming's Auto, 12% of New Horizon, 17% of Doherty's, and 12.5% of Napa Auto Parts. This is the intersection data. So I compared all of the intersections that were surrounding Emma's Place, the big ones. So we've got White Bear and County Road B and Van Dyke, White Bear and Culp, and Castle and White Bear. As you can see, the highest is White Bear and County Road B with 23, which is also one of our busiest intersections. And County Road B and Van Dyke with 14. All right, so let's look at the residential impact. And these are all going to be on the Van Dyke Street. So when you look at 2211 Van Dyke, they've got 38 calls for service in the past 6 years, which is pretty good. But then when you look to see what the MS Place involvement is, which is 8 of those calls, which is 21% of that 38 total. 2231 Van Dyke had 13% of calls related to MS Place. 2201 had 12%. 2260 had 18%, and 2210 that had a total of 9 had 1 interaction, which is 11%. On this slide, you'll see that of the 788 calls for service, the MS Place location is the precipitator of 557 of those calls, meaning the calls are stemmed from either calling from that address or the surrounding area for a crime or incident occurring specifically at that address. For those of you that are wondering how these calls compare to other low-income facilities, let me show you a comparison. I looked up another set of data regarding one other low-income multi-housing property, Maplewood. As you can see, MS Place info is on the left in gray in the previous slide. And in this one, on the left-hand side, we've got Maple Pond Apartments. So Maple Pond Apartments, they've got 168 total units. MS Place has 13. When we look at the calls for service, of those 168 units, there were 990 calls for service, which seems like a lot. But when we compare the units to the calls for service ratio, MS Place calls for service were much higher when you think of calls per unit. So when we look into it, 168 total units for 990 calls for service, that's about 6 calls per unit. But when we look at MS Place calls for service, that's 39 calls per unit. 39 calls per unit for 13 total units, 6 calls per unit for 168. This shows that MS Place uses 650% more resources than other comparable housing complexes. So I want to talk a little bit about our response. So working with our embedded social worker, we've been able to determine, what rental units need to be connected with services, and whether it's services for mental health or housing resources, our embedded social workers are doing a great job of providing any resources needed. We've also implemented a SARA model to problem-solving strategy, and we implemented that in January 2022. I continue to have bi-weekly meetings with MS Place management. And as part of our SARA model, we've also implemented zero tolerance for chargeable offenses. And that kind of helps in kind of a two-way street. So a lot of times we're not able to identify with the businesses who specifically committed what crime. If we're able to get the name and information of each person that committed a crime, we're able to send out a lease addendum violation. And so lease addendum violations occur when they break the crime-free, drug-free lease addendum that they sign and that all multi-housing renters sign in the city of Maplewood. And lastly, one of our biggest responses thus far is the nuisance violations. And at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Lieutenant Dugas, who's going to kind of talk through the nuisance violations.
Thank you, Ashley. We all know that the nuisance ordinance is a valuable tool for us to reclaim some of our lost resources when dealing with ongoing nuisance violations. And it also motivates the property owners to take action to correct the problems. With nuisance violations, we're very conservative in how we issue them out. For example, we do not issue out nuisance violations for anything that would be considered a normal police response. So if you're the victim of a fraud or identity theft, we do not issue nuisance violations. These violations are for ongoing repeat problems and repeat issues that are not being addressed. And I think that's very important to know that despite all the calls for service that we have at that location, we are very conservative in how we issue these out. We understand that it's a wonderful tool and we don't want to overuse it. As you can see from this slide, nuisance letters are trending up right now from 2019. 2020 was a slow year. However, they have increased and are continuing to increase. Of those nuisance violations, many of them occurred over spring break. I'm sorry, over the holiday break when the kids were out of school. In addition, while looking at the current nuisance violations for last week, it appears that they are going to receive 2 additional fines this week in regards to the nuisance violations that have been ongoing. Are there any questions about nuisance violations while we're on the topic?
You know, I think it's best if we kind of go through this, and we really appreciate it, Lieutenant Dugas, because then we're going to hear from Emma's Place and we'll circle back and we can get some clarifications then. I want to make sure that we give Emma's Place an opportunity to respond. I know that they have their own board meeting tonight. So let's hold off on questions at this point.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley.
All right. So just one more note on the nuisance violations. I want to bring up a little comparison. So as comparison, we looked up Golden Star Apartments. So Golden Star consists of 4 large 3-story apartment building housing, and they house hundreds of families, and they're the second leading recipient of nuisance violations. They've received 18 violations over the same time Emma's Place has received 38. So what can businesses do to assist? We recommend a couple things. First being citizens arrest. And when we say citizens arrest, it's initially the same thing as pressing charges. But it's important with bigger, more large scale companies that you know your corporate procedure regarding pressing charges. For zero tolerance on a crime and violation, it has to be a relationship strongly kept between the police department and its business community. We rely on the businesses just as much as they rely on us in situations of repeat offenders. So for citizens arrest, if you can do it, do it. There are very few exceptions for where officers can make the arrest without a citizen's arrest form. And the citizen's arrest form is very simple. It involves documenting the situation, what crime was committed, and some basic contact info. Citizens arrest forms allow us to make an arrest on behalf of the business for the crimes committed. All right, let's move on to trespassing. One way to keep individuals from coming back is to trespass them. If they come back, they can earn a free ride down to jail on the spot. There's no one specific trespass form, so each business can create their own template, or the police department can assist by filling one out with you. All a trespass needs is the name of the authority trespassing the suspect, the business name and address, the suspect's name and address, and the reason for the trespass. Private properties, businesses, can trespass anyone. Trespasses are good for 1 year. And if you keep your own trespasses on scene, make sure that you keep a copy for yourself and in most cases also for us. We will take that copy of the trespass and scan it into our record system so we now have a record of it. The biggest hiccup we see is if someone is verbally trespassed or trespassed from the store and we have no record of paper showing that they were trespassed. We can't really do much. If we have a copy of the trespass, even if the suspect has signed it or they've refused to sign it, if the suspect is notified that they are trespassed and there's paper of it, and they violate it, they're breaking the law. If you know who the repeat offenders are, even if you don't know their names, tell us. If you can describe them for us, even better. If you don't know the names of the suspect, they get arrested or we come in contact with them, you can always get a copy of the report that has their information on it. A lot of businesses that get a copy of their reports so they can issue trespass notices. To get a copy of police reports, you must first contact our police records department. Also, if you've got them on camera, we'll review the footage. This is also super helpful if you aren't sure who the suspect is. We sometimes take the pictures and create a police department internal and county-wide external ID request. These have been extremely helpful in past cases. Okay, and what we're kind of looking for when it comes to management assistance is enforcing the crime-free, drug-free lease addendum that they've all signed. Also activating and enforcing the rental review criteria. Harsher lease action for repetitive offenders and violations of laws. And zero tolerance for excessive calls for service and violent crimes, like the ones that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So looking towards the rest of 2022. From just what we know of 2022, the calls for Emma's Place are higher than they have been for January and February than they have been in the past 5 years. Also, just in the past month and a half, 6 nuisance letters have been sent out, which is the most in a consecutive 2-month period that we've had. The calls for service are similar in the DOC, disorderly conduct. However, we've had several instances, which is roughly 3 of the calls for service that we've just had, for juveniles playing with a fake toy gun, pointing at people, waving it around, and even imitating shooting children while they are at daycare. The calls seem to be escalating in nature, and we must continue to be vigilant and proactive at preventing further calls for service. Problem units must be dealt with not only on the police side with criminal charges, nuisance violations, and lease violations, but also internally within their residential management. I believe now that this information has been shared, we can all walk away with some more knowledge to aid us in our prevention of excessive calls for service. All right, so you all managed to make it through the presentation. I know it was a lot of information, especially a lot of math and numbers, so please, if you have any questions, anything that needs clarifying or any comments, please let me know. If you can't think of anything right now, but you wake up at 2 a.m. with a burning question you need answered, this is my contact information. I might not be up at 2 a.m., but I certainly will email you or call you back as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Officer Bergeron. We really appreciate that. Just for a little background for the council before I ask for Tanya Brownlow to join us. Little background, I started meeting with the businesses I want to say it was early last summer. And I first met with the executive director, Tanya Brownlow from Emma's Place, and then met with the businesses. And ultimately we had a meeting on August 10th between, it was the businesses, it was Emma's Place, and it was our police department to talk about some of the things that had been happening, the escalation in calls and the seriousness of calls, the harassment of staff members for our local businesses and customers at our local businesses, and also, concerns about the safety for the children living at Emma's Place. And we met in August and came up with a number of things to do to try to address some of these issues. And I will tell you, fellow council members, that we have another meeting tomorrow morning with the businesses, with Emma's Place, and with our police department again to talk about strategies that we're coming upon spring break. And we're also, believe it or not, we are looking ahead to summer break when, if you recall the bar graph that we just saw, those numbers can really escalate. And so what we're looking at doing is being proactive on how we can all work together to avoid these excessive calls for service. So I want to give Emma's Place an opportunity to share with us their thoughts and what they're doing and how they're participating with this so that we can have some really strategic intervention. So Tanya, let's see, do you want to start?
Yes. Hi. Hello, Mayor Abrams and City Council members. I'm Tanya Brownlow. I'm the Executive Director at Emma Norton Services. I also have with me Zanzele Isoki, who is a board member at Emma Norton Services, and she has graciously agreed to help take on from her expertise and background to work with the staff and residents and get us connected with people in her community that can help us with some of the strategies we want to use around restorative justice. I do just want to check in with Zenzeli quickly because I know she had her hand up for a while. Zenzeli, is there something you wanted to get a question answered first?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. I did have a question about the data that was offered. And I was just wondering, I just had really just two questions. About two, possibly three questions. Does the police department have a list of the names of residents, and particularly juvenile residents at Emma Norton Place, and or do the local businesses have a list of the residents and or juvenile occupants of Emma's Place?
I'm going to ask
Lieutenant
Dugas to respond to that. No, go ahead, Lieutenant Dugas.
And yeah, I just want to be clear. I was directing this toward the people who offered the analysis of Emma's Place activities.
We do not have a comprehensive list of the juveniles or residents at Emma's Place. We do have obviously our in-house records, which has most of the information in it as we find out. However, our information is sometimes out of date as people come and go and things of that nature.
Sure, and I ask that because it seems like you're using geographic location as a proxy for people, the folks who are causing, these so-called nuisances, as kind of directing that at Emma's Place, and especially since there's so few residents there. I was just trying to figure out how you all determined that these were indeed Emma's Place residents who were committing these different violations that were sparking the calls. And then my second question was basically, how many successful prosecutions has the Maplewood Police Department had of Maplewood residencies who were called in, who were reportedly engaged in activity that concerned business owners and neighbors?
Absolutely. We only take nuisance and enforcement action when we can positively identify the people involved. So that's either the officers interacting with them, identifying them, or the individual businesses that have previously trespassed those juveniles, have had previous incidents with the juveniles that are identifying them. As far as prosecution goes, the Maple Police Department does not handle prosecutions. That's up to the city and county attorney's office. And I do not have that information as far as their success with charging.
Sure. And so just in terms of being able to positively verify that the people who are sparking the calls are from Emma's Place, you don't have any kind of evidence or data to support that. It's just kind of an assumption that's being made based upon maybe how the people who are in the businesses look. I'm just trying to understand how one.
So when the officers are called there, they identify the individuals involved in the incident if they're on scene. Otherwise, we identify them through previous contacts. So if the business owner has previously trespassed those individuals, they obviously know who they are, and they provide that information. In other cases, we use surveillance video and things of that nature to identify the individuals. If we cannot identify the individuals, the nuisance call is not associated with Emma's Place.
And so,
thank you for that. Oh, go ahead. Did you have one other question? Otherwise, I wanted to turn it back over to Ms. Brownlow.
Well, yeah, it's just as a board member, I just feel like it's important to, when you present data, that it's actually clear and it's
sure.
Yeah, and so those were just my questions. Tanya, I can turn it over to you if you're okay with that.
Yeah, certainly. So, I guess in terms of our response, what I can say is one piece, and for context maybe, is to understand that it was clear to Emma's Place that in 2018 and 2019, we were seeing, those were the two, I believe, highest years, an increase in the police calls. And what we were hearing from residents currently living in the buildings then was that there wasn't enough accountability within the community, meaning our property management structure really involved the case managers and the supportive housing manager on site, which again are trained social service advocates, not people trained in property management and what that requires. So to that response, what we did was we hired a property manager, Ethan Allen, and so he's been on staff for about 2 years now. And that's where, again, when we brought a person in who has that dedicated view of how to enforce a lease and how to work with tenants, we did see that reduction. It hasn't gone as low as we would like it to do, and we are continuing to work on that. I can tell you that Ethan and Officer Bergeron and Officer Dugas have been able to set up really routine meetings, and that's one piece that Emma Norton Services has said would always be really critical in helping us to deal with some of these actions. For example, I will say the communication has greatly increased, and I thank the officers for that, to the point that I know already what they referenced last week, an incident that happened, I believe it was at the Maplewood Y, and then involved also CVS. That just happened over the weekend. We've already gotten those calls, and I know that Ethan is already following up with the program staff to deal with it with the families, as well as going to the families directly, and we'll follow up with lease violations. So I guess in terms of response, that's what I would say we are working on, is making sure we have that response time. We're also a couple of things that we have been able to put into place this year. We have been looking for more resources to put into Emma's place, and meaning staff time. I'm not exactly sure where Maple Pond is, and I understand it's a larger development. However, just for people to understand it, Emma's Place, one piece that we are really aware of is all of our families are single parent families with a minimum of 3 children. But typically in every one of those units, it's a single parent with 5, even up to 8 and 9 kids. So what we realize is that when we factor in the adults who live there compared to the number of juveniles, it greatly outweighs our ability to have eyes on things. So part of what we've tried to do is think about how we even change some of our service model and have more of a presence and more of intensive services at Emma's Place. So this year we've done some staff restructuring. Now in that community building, instead of having approximately 5 staff who work out of there, we actually have doubled it. We have 10 staff who work out of that building. We've also just secured a new contract with the Office of Justice Programs, and we will be able to hire a full-time clinical staff to again deal and have the ability to meet with kids and their parents and really work on mental health and trauma and recovery that we know the families that live at Emma's Place have gone through. I think it's important to bring up, and I don't say this as an excuse, but the last 2 years of data that we're looking at, we have all seen that the pandemic is having a huge impact on children who are not going to school, who are distance learning, as well as a huge impact on crime rates. And we're seeing that happen at Emma's Place. So we're really trying to figure out right now, what can we do, as Mayor Abrams said, what can we do to be more proactive? And I think some of the pieces that Zenzali has helped us with in meeting with staff is really think about how do we put together what we would call a safe summer campaign. How do we work with kids and think about positive behavioral interventions? The other thing that I'd love to dig in further with the police, and I know Officer Ashley and I had a quick conversation on this, but I would love to look at the data, especially from 2020 and 2021, because my understanding is typically it's not that all of the units are having this level of police calls, but it's specific units that have much higher rates of police calls. And so if we can start to think about, are the, and that's what I know Ethan has been working through. We have in the past 3 months asked one unit we did not renew their lease. we asked them to move, and a lot of that was because of that heightened criminal activity or incidents, but either whether on the property or off the property. We have another household where we know we have a lot of juvenile activity, and we are working with that family to move them also out of the Emma's Place community. And so we're really digging into like, who are the specific challenges that we have living in our community, and where can we work with them earlier to have interventions to do more lease training, as well as if they've had a long history of it, actually work to moving them out. One of the critical things that happened in 2020 was we did start a large scale renovation of the units, and we saw that the numbers fell, the number of units living there. So we had to have a priority of getting those units filled before we could continue to ask other units to leave. And that was just the nature of needing to be able to keep the property running in some ways, as well as while we try to work through issues to support families to see if they could change the behavior trajectory that they were on. I guess one other question I just have from Officer Ashley's, can you tell me a little bit more about the SARA model? I'm not familiar with that. So what does that stand for, and what does that look like?
Good question. Officer Bergeron, do you want to respond to that, please?
Sure. So when I talk about SARA models, I want to talk about so SARA is SARA, and each letter stands for a certain part of the SARA model. So, like I said, we implemented the SARA model earlier in the year, and SARA stands for, the S in SARA stands for scan. So you want to identify the recurring problem. So in this case, it's the high calls for service. The A, the first A in SARA, is the analysis. So this is where you identify and you research all the relevant data to include the stakeholders and the additional resources. The R in the SARA model is the response plan. So that's determining a response to the problem. So that's zero tolerance, the nuisance violations, the lease violations, keeping up with our PPVs and even multiplying them. And then we want to know for the for the R, it's response plan and response action. So we have a plan, but we need to execute that action. So we have where we document, at this date and this time, we did a PPV, we went out and we spoke to community, these different things happened. And then lastly, the A is assessment. So that's the assessment of the entire plan that you just made. What went right, what went wrong, determine whether the objectives were obtained, and identify new strategies if those are needed. So it's all kind of like this huge comprehensive problem-solving strategy.
Thank you for that. I'll circle back. Zenzela, do you have any other questions that you want to ask? I know both you and Tanya have a board meeting soon, and you're going to be leaving at 6:30.
I don't know if I have any more questions, as much as I would just like to say that, it's really tough to hear the way this data has been mobilized to problematize the most vulnerable communities, vulnerable population in Maplewood. I would like to be able to say that the young people, hopefully the city council and the mayor and even the law enforcement officers look and view the residents of Emma's Place as stakeholders and as a special population that is in need of support and services, and as community members who are looking for support, who are trying to build a better life for themselves, as opposed to kind of using this information to construe them as problems, which it seems to me, it's almost unsubstantiated based upon calls and hearsay. And I just think we should just be careful on how we stigmatize people who are doing their best. I mean, young mothers and family members who are doing their best, and not just kind of almost like profiling them based upon where they live. I just find that to be, as a board member and community member, and also as a single mom myself, I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment. and just to know that a community of people would use and mobilize resources in such a way to stigmatize the most vulnerable is just extremely disturbing, to be very honest. Yeah.
Zayla, I really appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. I will just respond, I guess, with indicating that my first meeting with Emma's Place and bringing the businesses together along with our police department occurred last August. And we met to try to work together to help Emma's Place and the families and the children succeed, and also to make sure that customers who come to our businesses and employees who come to work in our local businesses are all safe. And so in recognizing that, Emma's Place is a very important asset in our community, and we want Emma's Place to succeed. We also want to ensure that our businesses are safe places where people can work and customers can come to our local businesses. So we're trying to bring everyone together. This isn't about stigmatizing anyone. I think it's very important, and I really appreciate that our police department does keep this data. We need to identify where our resources are going, because resources that are overly stressed in particular areas mean that other places in our community don't have access to those kinds of resources, which is really why I believe that the City Council called for this workshop to find out what's going on and what can we do to help. We are committed to trying to work this through. Like I said earlier, we have a meeting tomorrow morning, and it's the local businesses, Emma's Place. I hope you would be able to come to that. And also our police department. And what we're looking for is strategies. You know, one thing that struck me last summer is that, you know, we all need to be together so that we know each other, that we have relationships with each other, so that we can strategize and come up with how do we solve some of these really pressing issues. And so tomorrow's focus is to try to avoid some of the increases that you saw in the bar graphs that typically occur during holiday breaks from school. We already saw that for the break that occurred in February, where I think we had 6 calls for service within a period of 5 days or 6 days, something like that. We want to try to address that head on. And I really appreciate Norton's responsiveness in doubling the size of staffing. You know, I was very troubled, I will say, last summer when I learned that during the summer months, there was less than 2 hours of programming that was actually happening at Emma's Place for any of the kids or the parents that were there. And so I really appreciate Emma's commitment to come forward and say, we need to do things differently, we need to do things better, and partner with our police department, because this really is about working together and doing some strategizing on how to make this work. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to hear from just a little bit, because I know that you're going to have to be leaving us soon, just a couple of minutes if there are questions from council members, because the council actually called for this workshop. And so I want to start with Councilmember Cave. Questions for Lieutenant Duga or Officer Bergeron, or for Board Member Izoki, or for Executive Director Brownlow?
I'll try to be a little concise here because I do have a lot, but I know everyone's going to want to turn here. For Emma's Place, my big question is lease addendum violations. And if you want to get back to us on this, fine, but I'm really I'm wondering what you're doing when juveniles have multiple violations in a home. What is being done when you say that you know certain homes have, you know, lots of problems per se? What is being done there? Are they, you know, it's a lease that they have it until the lease is up and then they won't get renewed? Or is there something you're working on to that they can be let go sooner if they're a problem? That was one question. I want to thank Ashley Bergeron and Lieutenant Dugas. I thought the report was great. It was very disturbing to see all the calls that were relevant, that you actually had people, that you had, juveniles that were clear. I know you said there was multiple ones that did not, and those weren't on the list. So I respect being transparent with that. We started this because we have such a strong business relationship and community relationship. And so many businesses we work with are so community orientated. And that means they do things outside their community, with people, with businesses. And, we want to bring Emma's Place into this. And it's the businesses around are really bothered by this. And so am I as a council person, all the juvenile incidents we have going around Emma's Place, and we need to find a solution. I'm a mother with a single parent of 5 children. It's not easy raising teenagers, but there's accountability, and accountability is where it starts, and they have to be held accountable. The, parents, the Emma's Place, the police are held accountable. Everybody does. It isn't just for kids to just run up and rack up all these things and they don't know where they're going. We can have programs for them, but I want to see what programs and when they start. There's Treehouse in Matamidi that I'm very well acquainted with, and I don't know if the kids go there, but there's just a lot of resources out there. And I would like to know when Emma's Place gets together, to come back to us and let us know what you're doing, because this is, a big step for us bringing everybody in, but I'd like to have us get together sooner than later and find out what the next move is. Thank you.
Thank you. Would someone from Emma's Place like to respond to that question?
Yes, I can respond. First of all, yes, we have a very strong relationship with Treehouse. We have quite a few of our teens and other kids who go out and access programming. I do know that they are potentially closing a site in the area, and I'm not sure if that's the site that you're referring to. Another piece is that's been part of the challenge is, again, when these are juvenile behaviors, and we recognize that they are juvenile behaviors, and parents, as Zanzali said, they are trying their best. But families come to us with a lot of deep needs. And so we've been trying to work with them to say, how can we create that accountability for the family without making the family homeless again? Because what we know is that's not a solution for the problem. It just passes people on into again, another crisis state. And what we want to do is to figure out how we can, support them. So there are lots of families where there have been difficulties, and then we've worked with kids. And again, it's not a continual problem. We work with the families, but there are some where we just are beyond that. And that's the question is, what do we do? The other piece is, I was going to say too, I think one thing that, again, back to Zanzali's point of how do we look at this data and how do we use it? It would be really helpful, again, to think about, as I was just looking at the situation over the weekend, and I know I got the calls for services report. There was one incident that happened. It kind of got spread. I can see that it went to multiple businesses, but it really did result in 4 different calls on that sheet. And so it would be really helpful for us to be able to also track what was an initial incident and how many calls does it take, like how many calls does it create? Because I think that would also give us some data that would also be more useful in how do we pinpoint these issues and get a better handle on them than just seeing the increases. So
sure.
Maybe
and then
that
helping
might be something, excuse me, that might be something, Tanya, that Officer Bergeron can work with Ethan Allen from your staff on to make sure that that data is understood in a way that you need in order to kind of operationalize that. But I think that that is something that maybe staff can work on. Councilmember Cave, did you have anything else?
Can I actually,
No,
I didn't
Oh.
actually answer your original question either. I just realized it. So you asked about how do we have to deal with the initial lease period? So the initial lease period for us, because of our funding, has to always be a 12-month period. And then the family is up at 10 months is when we start looking at whether we will renew their lease or not. It's extremely difficult in this day and age to evict a family before that initial lease process is up. The courts are much more willing to let tenants continue to live in their units versus hold an eviction. And of course, in also with being a supportive housing program, that's part of our mission and what we also have to carry out. So we take it very seriously that somebody would get evicted before that 12-month initial lease period.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, Councilmember Villavicencio.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say, well, thank you, Lieutenant, and thank you, Officer Bergeron, and thank you, Miss Tanya and Miss Zanzelli, for being here. You know, this issue is something that is important to me and weighs heavy on my heart. I obviously go by Emma's Place a lot. I mostly am a pedestrian around Maplewood, and so I know of this issue and I've known about it for a long time. And I don't really have any other questions. Some of my questions have been answered, but I guess my food for thought would be the fact that if we can do some coordinating together as a team, I think it would be the best possible. I remember back when Kid City and Maplewood was going on, we did a lot of work with the Tubman Center, and I know they do a lot of restorative justice things and programming with families. So maybe there's some crossover with the Tubman Center, and I know there's a lot of churches in our area, and they have programming as well, and people that can be connected in their lives, and yep, that's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also know, because I'm a member of the crime reduction leadership team with John Choi and with representatives from St. Paul and Ramsey County, that restorative justice in concerning juvenile issues is really central to what we're talking about in that group, to try to bring in justice circles and mediation and all sorts of different things that certainly are needed. And it's not just in Maplewood, it certainly is the entire metro area. So I know that some of that is coming. So with that, okay, let's talk to Councilmember Juniman.
Thank you, Mayor. I thought I would just rely a little bit on my history here, since I've been here since 2002. I remember when Emma's Place opened, they got their certificate of occupancy in that fall. We had a tour and the grand opening, and it was very impressive. And I know what their mission was at that time. And I guess I'm a little puzzled by some of the things I've heard from Tanya tonight, because the mission at that time seems to sound the same as it is now, that you're supporting families to the level of being able to succeed. So I'm wondering if, with that mission in mind, are you still following the model they did at the beginning? And I don't know how much full-time around the clock staff you have now. I sort of like an answer to that. But when I was first associated with them, and I spent a fair amount of time over there when they were new, each parent and every kid had a plan of where they were going. And they would meet with staff frequently to make sure they were on task. And it would be everything from a parent obtaining their GED to moving on to job training, to parenting classes, to cooking classes. I understand these are people who have had compromised lives and they're, if you will, behind the eight ball. But everybody needs structure and everybody needs a plan. And I understand that takes a lot of staff time, but that is the business that Emma's Place is in. And this, I went back and got some old numbers as well from the number of cases, police cases, and it's unbelievable how the increases happened. And yes, I know the world has changed. I don't live in a bag, but all the more reason from my standpoint that a supportive housing development has to be very well organized and planned to keep people on task, people who haven't been associated with organization and task, possibly by their circumstance in life. The only way they're going to learn how to be families is have a goal in mind that has some steps that each person can reach. And so I'm wondering if that's still done. Are there plans laid out for each parent and the in-house children? I do know that they had staff at that time that in response to the neighborhood at that time, they actually had a staff member who got the children on the school bus in the morning and a staff member who met them at the bus after school, and they went for after school homework help. So I'm just looking for, how is it structured? Do you have enough staff to do this? I sympathize hugely because I saw what it was at the beginning. It was unbelievable to me how successful they could be. I know it's a very difficult task, but I'm looking for how much staffing there is. Do you still make a plan for each household? Are they held to accountability for that plan? I do know that at that time, they also didn't want to evict anyone. They would do anything, stand on their heads to not. But if a family would not stay on task, that is something they would consider. And it would be brought up before the 12 months was up to give the family time to think, could they pull themselves together or not? So I guess I'm looking for some response about that.
Tanya or Zanzelli, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I can respond to that. I think one, again, thing for context is the Emma's Place program hasn't changed. In fact, we've tried to add more staff in, and we've added more staff in even this year to, again, help meet the needs of the families.
Right.
But what has changed in the 20 years since Emma's Place has opened is really the needs of the homeless community. After 20 years of continued living in poverty, what most advocates know is that our homeless population is growing in needs because living in poverty is a condition that creates even more harm and more trauma. I would say 20 years ago, my understanding when I first came to Emma Norton, Sherry Adams, who was the former program director and had been there for years since Emma's Place had opened, she even sat down with me, and this was 8 years ago, and said, when families first used to come, what the minimum criteria was that one person in the family had to have a disability. Typically, that was one of the children, maybe one of the parents, and maybe it was a diagnosis of anxiety or depression. But what we've seen is that the families coming in now, the parent has high mental health needs, high chemical use needs. The children, maybe 1 or 2 or 3, also have disability needs in terms of their own mental health and their own learning disabilities. So again, you have this layering on top of need. Also, in the Ramsey County system, years ago, the federal government made a decision to start a process called coordinated entry. So whereas at some point, Emma's Place could, I will say, pick and choose what families moved into the community, it doesn't have that ability anymore. Coordinated entry. So what that meant was you probably had families that were much more high functioning, that were able to go to every housing provider, get their name on a list, manage their ability on a waiting list. And they would be the ones that would move in because they were savvy enough to access the services. Now through coordinated entry, every family gets assessed through one central point. And when we have an opening, we send into that coordinated entry team, and they figure out the families with the highest needs to send to Emma's Place, because that's what permanent supportive housing is supposed to be able to do. And so it's this, the federal government wants that you actually get families with that high level of needs slated into permanent supportive housing programs versus rapid rehousing programs or just rental subsidies or something else where they don't have that intensive need. So yes, we still do all of those things with stability plans and case management and youth programming. We do not have round the clock staffing at this point any longer. We do staff on weekends and some evenings. We have invested last year. We put in a virtual security system. So we have security monitoring. And that was good to implement in the community. But that's what I would say is the change. So in Ramsey County also, families are waiting on shelter waiting lists.
Yep.
For even 3 to 6 months. So you have families now who are living in cars, riding the metros, being in trains, couch hopping. And again, a family, I was just looking at some data for our families. We had families that spent at least 8 months of that before they even got assessed for coordinated entry, before they were even able to move into Emma's Place. That is a family that's coming in with deep, deep needs. So I would say those stability plans aren't so much about, being able to move on and just start the process of whether it's job searching or whatever. It's time. Those families often come in and they just have so many deep needs of basic stuff because so much has fallen through the cracks while they've been waiting to have a home.
So my follow-up question to you then is, in your programming and the evolution of this housing, you now said permanent supportive housing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an open-ended time that people spend there, or is it permanent, meaning as long as they need the services you have to offer, or how is that kind of changed?
It's considered permanent for as long as the family meets the criteria. So again, they have to have a minimum of 3 kids. If a family census would drop below 3, then they wouldn't be eligible for their Section 8 voucher.
Right.
And then it's also, there's, along with that Section 8 voucher, they have to be under a certain income limit.
Yes.
So if a family, not to say that we don't work to get jobs, but I think, for instance, a family of 5 or 6 in our program would have to be making nearly $65,000 because it's considered, you base it on family size plus area median income. But our families coming in are at a threshold of, they're lucky if they're making $20,000 to $24,000 a year. It's going to be a long time before they would make that gap that they'd be at that level of.
Got it. So I understand that there's nothing moving on that there used to be, but I also hear what you're saying is that the needs to help these people is just for staffing is just phenomenal. I understand that.
Yeah.
So I guess my question to you is, who is Emma Norton still have a relationship with the Methodist Church? I mean, that was long going, but I don't know if it's still. Yes. Okay. So, are they represented on the board still?
Yes.
Okay. So do they understand what has changed for you? I mean, seriously.
I mean, they understand, but I think, again, the bulk of how you pay for service funding, that's part of the difficulty, is that Emma's Place 20 years ago opened with the same level of federal funding that it has today. The federal government does not raise that at all. So what at one time was meant to pay for a full-time case manager and part of a youth staff, or a full-time youth staff, now barely pays for one full-time case manager.
And they're real good at making demands and not paying for them. I totally understand that.
Yeah, but so it is looking at, I hear what you're saying. That's why we've gone out to do seeking of other government contracts like the Office of Justice and other things where we can add into the services. Yes.
Okay. And I do think, I just want to correct one thing. I think that Zealy said, I really don't think that this is an attempt by the police department to profile at all. If anything, it's to focus. How can we help this really disabled group of kids? And I think they understand really well from associating with, their outreach is phenomenal in my mind anyway, for a police department. Community policing is big here for helping who lives here. I think it's more, how can we help them become less of a focus for people's anger, like the businesses who don't want to be victimized and all those things, and how can we help get them on course? And I do think that there's a limit to what the police can do, but I do think they are willing to help as much as possible. And I don't want them to be seen as the cops with the badge and the gun on their belts. That's not what this is about at all. They are trying to help us see what needs to be done to help Emma's Place be as successful as they can with whatever help we are able to do. That is my total interpretation of this. So I wish that you would not take it as, oh, look at those kids. That's not what this is at all. And that I think, I don't know how many churches are involved with you at this point because of the pandemic and so on, but I do remember in the past that there were lists of people from different churches who were just dying to do homework help and that type of thing. So I'm hoping that we can get back to that as the pandemic at least recedes, because I think there are people in the community who really are wanting to help. I truly do.
I really appreciate that statement because it changes the tone. And I think it makes sense. I mean, I've just finished a pretty comprehensive report of interviews with staff and there's different people. And it seems to me like reframing it, particularly with the relationships with the businesses on how can we get involved. So one of the things that Emma Norton has faced is that almost the entirety of the staff has gone remote. And so that leaves a high need population with no support. And for the city, I would think that, the question, Kathy, that you said, how can we help? How can we support it? How can we avoid criminalizing young people? And I think that the business owners, the small business owners, city council members are a key part of that solution. So if we begin, and we started this process of thinking through a restorative justice program, it's important that those very people who are making the calls are part of that process so that the solution is one that comes from the community and not something that is kind of, passing the buck on or blaming the people who are the most disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, by, the uprisings and the killings and the rest of the catastrophe that exists in Minnesota right now.
I get it.
And I also think just, and I do have to jump off soon.
We have only one more council member, so I'm going to ask that you just stay on. I want to make sure that we give an opportunity for Councilmember Knudsen to ask questions as well. I really appreciate this dialogue. So Tanya, really quickly, and then we're going to jump to Councilmember Knudsen.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to make this sound like a blanket statement, but I think we have to acknowledge that it wasn't easy for Emma's Place to get created. There was a lot of community pushback. There was a lot of community support as well. Right. And I've heard about the packed rooms and people being angry. And I've heard of situations. And I think, again, what I keep trying to say when we think about restorative justice and how to solve this as a community, there has to on both sides be some acknowledgement of that history. And that there are times when police calls do get made. I've had a couple situations where, I've been told it was Emma's Place kids involved, and then I'll get the pictures or I'll get the actual, like, what happened. And what I'll find out is, yes, Emma's Place kids were there, but they weren't the ones actually being the aggressors. And I'm not saying that's all the time, but I'm saying until we can really dig down into what are these situations and stop having this big umbrella conversation about it's Emma's Place kids, because they're not all, that's where I think we just need to take this as a community.
Well, and I
thank you, Tanya. Kathy, I hate to cut you off, but I want to be respectful of, I want to be respectful of both Tanya and Zenzelli's time. And I want to make sure that I get Councilmember Knudsen so that we can make sure at least every council hold off on that. Kathy, I'll circle back to you. But Councilmember Knudsen, is there something you would like to weigh in on?
Yeah, I ran a residential treatment center for adjudicated delinquents for about 5 years. And I've heard a lot of this. In spite of the profile and the stigma, I can overlook that kind of thing. You've got enough data to figure out there's a problem there. And my guess is that you started out with a noble mission, which you still have. It's a great mission, solving, homelessness and and families that are in trouble and in great need, but you got overwhelmed. These kids, not all, but many are creating some incredible crimes. And, it's really hard for business owners enough to look the other way right now. They need to figure out that these kids are being dealt with. One of the things I recall in working with older children that were adjudicated is by the time they dealt with their problems, they hated the system, not what they did. So somehow or other, there needs to be a balance of appropriate intervention, recognition that they've committed crimes, and that the path they're on has got to be stopped. So I'm supportive. I recognize it, but this isn't about weak data or profiling or stigmatizing. This is a serious problem in this community, and you were overwhelmed. This is not what you intended to do in the beginning, and I don't believe you probably have the resources to deal effectively with some of these kids. So that's all I'm going to say for now.
Thank you. And I know that, we've got 5 minutes left. So Councilmember Juniman, I'll circle back to you, and then I will close this out. We'll finish up right at 7. Councilmember Juniman.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to say to Tanya that I hope that you stay closely involved with what the mayor's trying to do. We are working really hard in many ways to be an inclusive community, and she is working really hard to try and get everybody to understand each other here. And I know what you said before, and I get it, I understand, but in some ways, these kids also have to learn to understand that if they happen to be around something that happens, it's going to impact them. And that's a life lesson. That isn't just about now. So I think there's got to be some understanding on both sides. And I really think what the mayor's trying to do with you and the business owners is a huge step in trying to make things better for you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Juniman.
And
I
we will
just want to
definitely
close
stay
this
at the
out by
table.
thanking the council for their compassion, for their concern. I want to thank our police department for all of the efforts that you are making in trying to come together with this. I want to thank our businesses. I got involved with this. It was brought to my attention last summer, and it wasn't just the numbers. I want to make that really clear. It wasn't just the numbers. My big concern was that the nature of the escalating issues, the escalating crime, they were becoming more violent, more serious. And my concern was that someone would get hurt. And we needed to open up these lines of dialogue and have discussion about this so that we can have some meaningful conversation and that we can come up with some solutions. The only way to do that is to talk about it. And these are challenging conversations, no doubt. And these are difficult issues, but we have to discuss them. We can't shy away from these kinds of conversation. And I think that holding everyone accountable is really important because that's really what Maplewood is all about. We are a city that really values our businesses. We value Emma's Place. We really care about kids in our community and we want them to succeed. And so we all need to be kind of on the same page on this. I look forward to the meeting in the morning with the businesses. And I look forward to having a strategy that we can all understand and be part of. I really think the businesses, they had some great ideas at our last meeting. And I know in particular that Target was stepping up and was volunteering to come in and help work with Emma's Place. And some of the other businesses were as well. So I think that this is an initial step. And I really appreciate everyone for participating in this. It's not easy, but we can do better. And we can do that by starting off with discussion. So with that, it is now almost 7 o'clock. And I am going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you. And council members, we will be back. Let's take 5 minutes. So we'll start shortly after 7 o'clock for our regular council meeting. I appreciate all of your comments tonight. Thanks. We are adjourned.
Thank you, Mayor.